My name is Amelia Scott, Major, United States Air Force. At 42, they still call me Phoenix, a legend born from the ashes. But today, in the briefing room at Vanguard Air Force Base, Colorado, that legend was being treated like a joke. When I walked in, Lieutenant Reeves, a young pilot who could have been my little brother, looked me up and down and smirked. "Sorry, Major, this is the flight squadron briefing. Were you maybe looking for the admin office to make coffee?" A wave of snickers rippled through the room, but the deepest cut came from Lieutenant Colonel Jake Harmon, our commander. He clapped Reeves on the shoulder, laughing. "Now, boys, let's respect our elders. Major Scott used to be one hell of a pilot. Back in the day." He thought this public humiliation would bury me. But he didn't know. He was the reason I was here. And I brought with me a memory he tried to burn to ash 10 years ago. If you have ever been dismissed and cast aside by the very people you trusted most, let me know where you're from. Hit that like button. Because this story is about finding your voice when the whole world wants you to be silent. The briefing room at Vanguard Air Force Base smelled of two things: the acrid, slightly burnt coffee that fuels the Air Force, and testosterone. It was an atmosphere thick with the aggressive confidence of young men who believed they were immortal. Through the large plate glass window, the morning sun cast a brilliant glow on Pikes Peak, its stoic purple majesty a silent rebuke to the pettiness unfolding within these walls. I found a spot along the back wall, my posture ramrod straight, my flight suit crisp. It was a uniform I'd earned the right to wear through thousands of hours in the air and 2 combat tours. To them, it was just a costume on a museum piece. The words from Lieutenant Reeves weren't a surprise, not really. I had seen his type for 2 decades, the swagger that hadn't yet been tempered by fear, the arrogance that mistook experience for obsolescence. Were you maybe looking for the admin office to make coffee? The snickers that followed were predictable, the juvenile pack mentality of young wolves. My spine remained locked, my gaze sweeping across the room with a practiced coldness that betrayed nothing. But inside, a fist was squeezing my lungs shut. The air, already thin at this altitude, felt impossible to draw. The real blow, the one that landed with the force of a physical impact, was Harmon's. His laugh wasn't just joining in, it was an endorsement. "Let's respect our elders." He said it with a wide political smile, but his eyes, small and dark, held a flicker of genuine, malicious satisfaction. He was enjoying this. He was orchestrating it. My mind, trained to process threats in microseconds, categorized this one instantly. Not a physical enemy, but a political one, far more dangerous in the sterile corridors of a stateside base. I didn't say a word. In this arena, silence was my only armor. Decades of iron military discipline was the scaffolding holding me upright. This wasn't a show of disrespect for a superior officer. This was the calculated dismissal of a relic, a ghost they'd brought home and didn't know what to do with, other than wait for her to fade away. The suffocating silence was shattered by a new voice, one that carried the effortless authority of true command. "Major Scott, good to have you back, Phoenix 1. Colonel Mason, the base commander, stood in the doorway. He was a tall, lean man with a face carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. He didn't shout, but his voice cut through the tension like a laser. The snickers died instantly. Lieutenant Reeves's smirk evaporated, his face paling slightly. The call sign: Phoenix 1. Hearing it from the highest authority on this base was like a splash of ice water on the room. It wasn't just a nickname, it was a title, a piece of history that every pilot in that room had heard stories about. Harmon's transformation was immediate and seamless. The smug commander vanished, replaced by an attentive, almost fawning subordinate. "Sir, we were just getting started." He strode over to me, placing a hand on my shoulder in a gesture of false camaraderie that made my skin crawl. "Colonel, I was just welcoming Major Scott to her new role." He turned back to the room, his voice now booming with forced enthusiasm. "Gentlemen, for those of you who don't know, this is Major Amelia Scott. She's a legend, and she'll be serving as our new squadron safety officer." He paused, letting the title hang in the air before delivering the poisoned pill. "Her role will be primarily supervisory, of course, observing and reporting, She won't be interfering with our operational tempo. He said it so smoothly. In one breath, he acknowledged my rank while simultaneously neutering it. I was a watchdog with no teeth, a queen in a ceremonial role, allowed to watch the real knights joust from a distant balcony. I was an outsider in my own profession, by his design. After the briefing, Harmon waved me into his office. It was a shrine to his own career, walls covered in polished plaques, challenge coins displayed under glass, and strategically placed photos of him shaking hands with smiling generals. He gestured for me to sit as he moved to a small wet bar in the corner. "Drink, Amelia?" he asked, his voice now oozing a familiar, syrupy charm. He didn't wait for an answer, pulling out a bottle of Knob Creek and 2 heavy crystal glasses. The sight of the dark amber bourbon hit me harder than Reeves's insult. It was David's favorite. He poured 2 fingers' worth into each glass and handed one to me. "Welcome home," he said, settling into his large leather chair. "I imagine the last 10 years have been quiet for you. Things are faster now, more streamlined, all about performance metrics." Every word was a carefully aimed dart. Quiet life was his code for the desk jobs I'd taken, the instructor roles, the years I'd spent away from the combat cockpit after Kandahar. Faster now was his way of saying I was too slow, that I couldn't keep up. He was painting my trauma as a voluntary retirement, a flight from the pressures he now thrived on. I let the bourbon sit on the corner of his desk, untouched. My discipline held. I would not give him the satisfaction. "I'm sure I'll manage, Colonel," I said, my voice even. He just smiled, that same satisfied look in his eyes. My temporary office was exactly what I expected. A small windowless room in the basement, smelling faintly of stale air and old files. It was a closet they had cleared out, a place for things you were required to keep but hoped to forget. It was perfect. No distractions. I spent the next hour requisitioning maintenance logs for the HH-60 Pave Hawk fleet, the same model of helicopter I flew in Afghanistan. The first file that landed in my inbox was a consolidated maintenance history from our old unit, the one deployed to Kandahar. I opened it, my fingers moving methodically across the keyboard. And then, I stopped. My heart didn't just stop. It felt like it seized, the muscle clenching into a cold, hard knot in my chest. There on the screen was a digital work order, dated 10 years ago, just 2 days before the crash. The subject line was stark: "Deferral of upgrade, HH-60 Fire Suppression Warning Module." It was a request to push the mandatory software update to the end of the deployment cycle to avoid grounding the helicopters for 48 hours. And at the bottom, in the digital signature block under Approving Technical Authority, was the name Captain Jake Harmon. At that exact moment, a notification pinged softly on my screen, a new email. The sender was anonymous, the subject line blank. I clicked it open. There was only one sentence: "They don't want a phoenix, they want a canary in a cage." That night, the ghost of Jake Harmon's signature followed me home. It haunted the sterile quiet of my small, rented apartment on the outskirts of Colorado Springs. It was the key that unlocked a door I'd spent a decade trying to seal shut. Sleep didn't offer an escape, it offered a reenactment. I woke up gasping, my body drenched in a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the chill of the mountain air outside. The dream was always the same, a high-fidelity recording etched onto my soul. Kandahar, the shriek of twisting metal, the percussive, deafening boom that ripped the night apart. I could still feel the wave of heat, a physical blow that blasted through the cockpit, smelling of jet fuel, burning electronics, and something else. Something sickeningly metallic and final. I could feel the uselessness of the cyclic stick in my hand, a dead weight that no longer commanded the machine. The screams were there, a chaotic chorus of terror and pain. But in the dream, I could never hear David's voice calling my name. I only heard the sound of my own failure. For 10 years, that was where the nightmare ended, in the fire and the falling. But tonight, my subconscious added a new scene, a director's cut inspired by the day's events. As the burning wreckage of our HH-60 faded, a figure emerged from the shadows, It was Harmon. He wasn't running toward the flames to help. He was standing at a distance, watching the inferno with a face that was unnervingly calm, almost placid. His expression was a cold, flat line. My grief, a formless entity of guilt and loss for a decade, now had a face. And it was a face I had seen smiling at me over a glass of bourbon just hours before. My mind, seeking refuge from the horror, drifted back further to the moments before the ash. Back to the relentless, oppressive heat of the Afghan sun. The grit of sand was a constant companion, in our food, in our beds, between our teeth. Kandahar Airfield was a monochrome world of beige dust and beige buildings, a place where the only vibrant colors were the orange and pink streaks of the sunset. One evening, just a week or so before the crash, David and I found a quiet spot on the flat roof of a concrete maintenance building. We were sharing a Hershey's chocolate bar he'd gotten in a care package from his sister in Ohio. It had melted and reformed in its wrapper a dozen times, but it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. "You know what I'm gonna do when I get out of this dust bowl?" he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. David Vance was a man of quiet strength, a pilot whose calmness under pressure was legendary. But when he talked about the future, a boyish excitement broke through. "Let me guess," I said, licking the melted chocolate from my fingers. "Buy a fishing boat and disappear into the Florida Keys?" He laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Close. I'm going to open a flight school. Not for rich kids. For kids from tough neighborhoods, kids in the system. Show them there's a way up, a way out." He believed in the sky. He believed it could save people, just like it had saved him. The heavy thud of combat boots on the ladder broke the spell. It was Harmon, then a captain and our unit's senior technical officer. He climbed onto the roof, a self-satisfied smirk already in place. "Enjoying the view, kids?" he said, clapping David on the back a little too hard. He glanced at me, then looked back at David, his words seemingly a compliment, but the subtext was sharp as a razor. "You're lucky to have David as your co-pilot, Scott. He's the real strategic thinker in the cockpit." He'd always done that. With a casual phrase or a backhanded compliment, he would subtly reposition me as the sidekick, the one lucky to be there. In his world, David was the calm, strategic male pilot, and I was the female pilot. The unspoken asterisk. David, to his credit, never bought into it. He saw me as his equal, his partner. He just rolled his eyes at Harmon and handed me the last piece of chocolate. But the seed of Harmon's condescension had been planted long before his signature ever damned us. The memory shifted again, closer to the end. The image was so clear it felt like I could reach out and touch it. We were in the cramped maintenance hangar, the air thick with the smell of grease and oil. David was holding a thin sheaf of papers, his brow furrowed with a frustration that was rare for him. It was a technical report he'd written himself, full of jargon and data charts. But the conclusion was simple. He believed there was a latent flaw in the fire warning system's software. A glitch that could cause a catastrophic delay between an engine fire and the alert in the cockpit. "I already submitted this to Harmon," he told me, his voice tight with annoyance. "You know what he said?" I shook my head. "He said it was a minor software anomaly." David spat the words out like they were poison. "Told me we couldn't afford to let trivialities impact our mission tempo. He buried it. Just buried it." And then came the part that had gnawed at me every single day for 10 years. I remembered what I said next. I remembered the exhaustion, the desire for things to just be simple for once. I remembered trusting the chain of command more than I trusted my own partner. "He's the tech expert, David," I had said, trying to be reassuring. "If he's not worried, we shouldn't be. Don't sweat it. Don't sweat it." The regret was a physical thing, a cold weight in the pit of my stomach. I had dismissed his concern. I had sided with the system, with Harmon's smug confidence. I had failed him long before the engine did. Back in the cold darkness of my apartment, I sat up and swung my legs off the bed. I walked over to my duffel bag and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. Inside was the only thing I had recovered from his personal effects. His dog tags. They were warped and blackened by the fire, the edges melted and smooth. I clenched them in my fist, the metal cool against my sweat-slicked palm. His last words to me echoed in my mind. It was right before that final flight, during our pre-flight checks. I'd been unusually tense, a knot of anxiety in my gut I couldn't explain. He must have seen it on my face. He leaned over and bumped his helmet against mine. "Fire's not the enemy, Amelia," he'd said, his voice calm and steady in my headset. "Fear is. Don't let it make your decisions for you." For 10 years, I had let it. I had let fear and guilt and a soul-crushing sense of survivor's shame make every decision for me. I had retreated into quiet, safe roles. I had allowed the legend of the Phoenix to become just that, a story about someone I used to be. I had stayed silent. But now, sitting in the dark, clutching the last remnant of the best man I ever knew, something shifted. The humiliation in that briefing room, the condescending smile on Harmon's face, and his signature on that digital death warrant, they hadn't buried me. They had acted like a defibrillator, shocking a part of me I thought was long dead back to life. The Phoenix wasn't a myth. It was a promise. And it was time to rise. I wouldn't hide anymore. I would find justice for David, even if I had to burn Harmon's entire world to the ground to get it. The morning after my vow to David, I began my war. But this war wasn't fought with helicopters and missiles. It was fought with paperwork. It was a slow, soul-crushing battle against an enemy far more insidious than any insurgent: military bureaucracy. My objective was simple. I wanted the maintenance and performance logs for the new Skyguard simulation program, the same one Harmon was so proud of. My first request was met with a polite, automated denial. "Access requires squadron commander's signature." Fine. I filled out a new form, citing my authority as squadron safety officer, and routed it to Harmon's office. The response came back 3 days later. "Request denied. Documents classified above your clearance level." A blatant lie. I had one of the highest security clearances on the base. I tried a different approach, requesting anonymized system data instead of specific pilot logs. The answer was different, but the result was the same. System currently undergoing software upgrades. Data unavailable. Harmon had built a fortress of administrative red tape around his squadron, and I was on the outside, throwing pebbles at the walls. The other officers in the command wing started treating me like I was radioactive. Their conversations would stop when I entered the break room. Their eyes held a mixture of pity and annoyance. I was no longer Major Scott, the legendary Phoenix. I was the ghost of Kandahar. The inconvenient woman digging up a past everyone wanted to keep buried. I was a disruption to the smooth, efficient machine Harmon had built, and the machine was closing ranks to protect itself. The isolation was exhausting. My days became a monotonous cycle of submitting forms, being denied, and re-strategizing. My nights were spent alone in my apartment, listening to Brené Brown audiobooks on my phone. Her voice, calm and reassuring, was a lifeline in the silent void. I'd listened to her talk about the power of vulnerability, and one phrase kept replaying in my head. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. It felt like a foreign concept. In my world, vulnerability was a liability that could get you killed. But here, in this quiet war, maybe it was the only weapon I had left. A week into my paper-pushing campaign, I was assigned to supervise a simulation run for Lieutenant Reeves. I sat at the safety officer's console, a secondary station behind the main simulation techs, watching the virtual cockpit on my monitor. Reeves was flying a complex mountain rescue scenario. For all his arrogance, the kid could fly. He was smooth, precise. And then I saw it. A flicker on my diagnostic screen that wasn't part of the scenario. The engine temperature for the virtual HH-60 was climbing, slowly at first, then rapidly. It was an impossible rate of increase, a clear indicator of a catastrophic oil leak. But on the main cockpit display in front of Reeves, the warning light remained dark. My blood ran cold. It was happening again. The same sequence, the same failure to warn. My hand shot out and slapped the emergency stop button. The simulation froze. The roar of the virtual rotors died, plunging the room into an abrupt, confusing silence. Reeves ripped his helmet off, his face flushed with anger. "What the hell, Major? I was in the middle of a critical maneuver. Before I could answer, Harmon was there, appearing as if from nowhere. He glanced at my screen, then at the main display, his face a mask of bored indifference. "Just a minor software bug, Lieutenant," he said, his voice calm and dismissive. "Reset the scenario and continue." "Sir," I said, standing up, my own voice tight but controlled. That wasn't a bug. The engine was overheating. The warning system failed to activate. Harmon turned to look at me, and his eyes were like chips of ice. He wasn't speaking to me as a fellow officer. He was speaking down to a hysterical patient. "Major, let's not let our personal history cast a shadow on the training of these young men." He leaned in, lowering his voice just enough so only I and the techs nearby could hear. "Don't let your ghosts fly the simulator." It was a public execution of my credibility. He had taken my deepest trauma and twisted it into a weapon, using it to paint me as unstable, unreliable. He dismissed my professional judgment as a symptom of PTSD in front of the very pilots I was supposed to protect. I saw the look in their eyes change from confusion to a kind of smug understanding. Oh, that's what this is, the old pilot who cracked. I just stood there, my jaw clenched, the silence my only defense. That evening, I couldn't face the thought of my empty apartment. I drove to a small, all-American diner just off the highway, the kind with cracked red vinyl booths and a jukebox that probably still played Elvis. I ordered the meatloaf special. It came out dry and overcooked, sitting in a pool of greasy gravy, but I barely noticed. I was just pushing the food around my plate, the scene from the simulator replaying in my head. I felt utterly alone, completely defeated. "Major Scott?" The voice was so quiet I barely heard it. I looked up. It was Airman First Class Kara Goyan, one of the young simulation technicians. She couldn't have been more than 20, with wide, nervous eyes and hands that fidgeted with the hem of her uniform. "At ease, Airman," I said, my voice hoarse. She swallowed hard, glancing around the diner as if expecting Harmon to materialize from the kitchen. "Ma'am," she whispered, leaning closer. "What happened today?" "In the sim. It wasn't a software bug." I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "Someone overrode the warning thresholds," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "They're coded to trigger much later, to make the simulations run smoother, I guess." Before I could ask another question, she straightened up, her face pale with fear. "I have to go." She turned and practically fled from the diner, leaving me staring after her. My gaze fell to the table. She had left her paper napkin behind. I picked it up. It felt heavy. Tucked inside the folds was a tiny black flash drive, a silent act of rebellion. If you've ever been in a position where you saw something wrong and a younger colleague, someone with everything to lose, was the one who bravely stepped up, I want you to hit that like button for them. Let's show some support for the quiet courage that holds the world together. And in the comments, just type the word courage if you believe one small act can change everything. Back in my apartment, I plugged the USB into my personal laptop. It was a risk, but I had to know. The drive contained a handful of files, raw system logs, lines of code, and a time-stamped event journal from the simulation. It was all there, clear as day. A manual override of the safety parameters logged under an administrator's account just minutes before the simulation began. Kara had given me the smoking gun. She had put her entire career, her future, in my hands. I thought of Brené Brown's words again. Courage is showing up and letting ourselves be seen. Kara, a young airman with everything on the line, had shown up. She had let me see the truth. Now it was my turn. I had to be worthy of that trust. I had to be her shield. Trust is a fragile currency in the military, easily spent and hard to earn. Kara Goyan had handed me a fortune, and I knew I had to protect her investment. I sent her a coded, single-word text. Sunrise. And then a map pin. I chose a place that was public, yet offered privacy. The Perkins Central Garden Trail at Garden of the Gods. No one would think twice about two servicewomen out for an early morning hike. The dawn was spectacular. The first rays of sun ignited the colossal red sandstone formations, setting them ablaze against a crisp, cobalt blue sky. The air was thin and cold, smelling of pine and damp earth. I saw Kara waiting for me near the base of a towering rock spire. She was shivering, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from fear. "You did a brave thing, airman," I said, my voice low. She hugged her arms to her chest, her breath coming out in white puffs. "I almost didn't," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "After you left the sim room, Colonel Harmon kept the lead tech and me behind. He told the tech to calibrate the safety parameters. He said we needed to optimize training time and cut down on nuisance warnings." She looked up at me, her young face a portrait of conflicted duty. "It's wrong, ma'am. I joined the Air Force because my dad was a crew chief. He always said the machines have to be perfect because the lives inside are priceless. What Colonel Harmon is doing, it feels like a betrayal of that. I saw in her a younger version of myself, idealistic, fiercely committed to doing the right thing, and terrified of the consequences. I thought of Brené Brown's idea of daring greatly, of stepping into the arena and allowing yourself to be seen. This young airman had just stepped into a very dangerous arena. It was my duty to make sure she wasn't alone. I put a hand on her shoulder, my grip firm and reassuring. "You're not betraying anything, Kara. You're honoring it. You have my word. I will protect you. We're going to get through this together." It wasn't just a promise from a major to an airman. It felt like a promise from an older sister, a commitment I hadn't realized I was capable of making. Later that week, I was on the observation deck overlooking the flight line, monitoring a live fire training exercise. Lieutenant Reeves was in the lead helicopter. He was pushing the envelope, executing a series of aggressive, high-speed maneuvers through a canyon course. Too aggressive. I saw him misjudge a turn, his rotor wash kicking up a blinding cloud of dust as his tail swung dangerously close to the canyon wall. The radio crackled with the panicked voice of his co-pilot. "Watch your six, Reeves. You're too close." But Reeves was fighting the controls, overcorrecting. Instinct took over. I keyed my mic. My voice was calm, cutting through the static. "Reeves, Phoenix 1, stop fighting the skid. Ease off the collective, nose down 5 degrees. Let the aircraft stabilize itself." There was a moment of silence on the radio. He could have ignored me. He could have told the old relic on the ground to stay out of it. He didn't. I watched on the monitor as he followed the instructions precisely. The helicopter settled, the wobble disappeared, and he smoothly exited the canyon. When his team landed, Reeves climbed out of the cockpit, his face pale under his helmet. He walked past the ground crew, his path taking him right by me. He didn't say a word. He didn't even make eye contact. But as he passed, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't gratitude. It was something else. A flicker of respect. A crack in the wall of his prejudice. It was a start. That night, I was standing in my kitchen, about to grill a piece of chicken for a lonely dinner of one. My meal prep was Spartan and efficient. A 6-ounce chicken breast and a cup of steamed broccoli. The doorbell rang, a sound so unexpected it made me jump. I opened the door to find Kara Goyan standing there, shifting nervously from foot to foot. In her hands, she held a large, greasy, gloriously fragrant box from Pizza Hut. A 2-liter bottle of Coke was tucked under her other arm. She stammered, holding the box out like an offering. "I just thought, maybe you shouldn't have to eat dinner by yourself, Major." My throat tightened. For a moment, I couldn't speak. A simple act of kindness, of human connection, felt so overwhelming it nearly brought me to my knees. "Come in, Kara," I finally managed to say. We didn't bother with plates. We sat on the floor of my sparsely furnished living room, cross-legged, leaning against the couch. We ate pepperoni pizza straight from the box and drank Coke from red plastic cups. She told me about her family back in Michigan, about how she'd joined the Air Force to pay for college and make her dad proud. And for the first time in 10 years, I found myself talking about David. Not about the crash, but about him. About his terrible jokes, his obsession with the Chicago Cubs, and his dream of opening a flight school. We were an unlikely pair, a 42-year-old major with more ghosts than furniture, and a 20-year-old airman with a dangerous secret. But in that small apartment, surrounded by the smell of cheap pizza, we had formed a temporary family, a tiny alliance held together by courage and mutual respect. It was a warmth I hadn't felt in a very long time. The warmth didn't last. The next morning, I walked out to the parking lot and found my Ford F-150 tilted at a strange angle. I got closer, and my stomach dropped. All 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber sliced open with deep, vicious gashes. There was no note. There were no witnesses. But the message was as clear as a direct order. Harmon knew. He knew I was digging, and he was done with subtle warnings and office politics. This was an escalation. This was a threat. I stood there in the cold morning air, looking at the violation of my property, my personal space, but I didn't feel fear. I felt a strange, cold clarity. The fire he was trying to extinguish inside me, the one Kara's courage had helped reignite, was now burning hotter than ever. He thought this would scare me off. He had no idea what he had just unleashed. The summons came the next morning, not as a polite email or a phone call, but as a young, stone-faced airman appearing at my basement office door. "Major Scott, Lieutenant Colonel Harmon wants to see you in his office. Immediately." There was no room for discussion. This wasn't a request, it was a command. Walking into Harmon's office felt like stepping into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. He was seated behind a massive oak desk that looked like it had been carved from a fallen giant. The desk, and the entire room, was his fortress. The walls were a calculated display of power, framed degrees, medals gleaming in shadow boxes, and a dozen photos of him smiling alongside powerful men with stars on their collars. He was the king on his throne, and I was the subject being called to account. He gestured to the chair opposite him, a warm, disarming smile on his face. This was the first stage of his attack, the classic psychological tactic of a predator. Lull the prey into a false sense of security. "Amelia, have a seat," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "How are you settling in? I hope the incident with your vehicle wasn't too much of an inconvenience. Vandals, you know." "Terrible." He feigned concern, but his eyes were watching me, gauging my reaction. I gave him nothing. I simply sat, my back straight, my hands folded calmly in my lap. "I was just reviewing your file again," he continued, leaning back in his chair. "Remarkable career. Truly. Your experience is invaluable to us, which is why I'm a little concerned." This was it, the pivot. He had offered the honey, now came the venom. He slid a thin manila folder across the polished surface of the desk. It stopped a few inches from my hands. I didn't need to open it. I knew what it was. The letterhead was from the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. It was my psychological evaluation from 10 years ago, the one that detailed every nightmare, every panic attack, every raw nerve exposed after the crash. "I know what you've been through, Amelia," he said, his voice dripping with a thick, artificial sympathy that made my stomach turn. "Post-traumatic stress is a hell of a thing, a terrible thing. It can make us see connections that aren't there, threats that don't exist." He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, adopting the posture of a caring therapist. "You've been under a lot of stress. You're asking for old files, seeing phantom failures in the simulators. Maybe you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. It happens to the best of us." The audacity of it was breathtaking. He was weaponizing my pain. He was taking the deepest wound of my life and attempting to use it as a tool to discredit me, to paint me as an unhinged woman haunted by her own demons. He wasn't just dismissing my concerns, he was trying to invalidate my sanity. Every word was a calculated piece of gaslighting designed to make me doubt myself, to make me feel small and broken. The rage that had been simmering inside me began to burn with a cold, clear intensity. I met his gaze and held it, my silence a shield against his poison. My refusal to crumble seemed to frustrate him. The mask of the concerned commander slipped, and the predator underneath emerged. His voice dropped, losing its warmth and taking on the hard, sharp edge of tempered steel. "Listen to me, Scott," he hissed, the use of my last name, a a deliberate act of distancing. This is my squadron, my program. You do your paperwork, you fill your square, and you stop digging up things that are meant to stay buried. Is that clear? I remained silent, my eyes locked on his. He slammed his hand flat on the desk, the sound cracking through the quiet office like a gunshot. David is dead. It was a tragedy, an accident. Accept it. Don't make me bury your career right alongside his memory. There it was, the explicit threat. He was holding my entire life's work hostage. He would use that file, twist its clinical language into a narrative of instability, and have me medically discharged. He would strip me of my rank, my honor, my very identity as a soldier. He was threatening to take the one thing I had left. The name, Phoenix, would be reduced to a cautionary tale about a pilot who couldn't handle the pressure. He would erase me. Something inside me snapped, not in a loud, explosive way, but in a quiet, profound shift of tectonic plates. The fear, the guilt, the decade of self-doubt, it all fell away, burned to ash by the sheer force of his malice. All that was left was a core of pure, unyielding resolve. A verse I hadn't thought of since I was a child in a Midwest church pew rose in my mind, clear as a bell. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. I slowly rose to my feet, not breaking eye contact. The act of standing shifted the power dynamic in the room. Now I was looking down at him. You're wrong about one thing, Colonel, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that made him flinch. It was the voice of a commander, not a victim. I wasn't buried in the ashes of Kandahar, I continued, each word carefully chosen, precise. I was forged in them. I was reborn. And this time, I will not let you, or anyone else, light the match. I let the words hang in the air for a beat, watching the shock and fury bloom on his face. You can walk through your own valley of shadows, Harmon, I said. But I will not be afraid. I turned my back on him, the ultimate dismissal, and walked out of his office, my steps even and measured. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The war was no longer a quiet one. The battle had been declared. The day of Lieutenant Reeves's final check ride felt less like an evaluation and more like a coronation. The control room for the advanced simulator was packed. Harmon was there, of course, along with several other senior officers, all gathered to witness the success of his prized pilot and his cutting-edge training program. I was relegated to the safety officer's console in the corner, a designated observer with no official input. My presence was a formality, a box to be checked. Harmon was in his element, holding court. He stood behind Reeves's chair, a hand on the young pilot's shoulder, projecting an aura of smug satisfaction. Reeves, fueled by this confidence, was flawless. He moved through the initial scenarios: in-flight refueling, low-altitude troop insertion, bad weather navigation. With a fluid, almost arrogant grace. From the corner of my eye, I could see Harmon glance in my direction every few minutes, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. His expression was clear. See? My system is perfect. You and your ghosts are irrelevant. The air in the room was thick with a self-congratulatory confidence that made my skin prickle. Then, the final scenario initiated. The words flashed on the instructor's screen. Dual engine fire on takeoff. It's one of the worst-case scenarios a pilot can face. A catastrophic failure at the most vulnerable moment. In the simulator, a sudden jolt shook the cockpit. Red lights, which should have been flashing, remained dark. But the audio alarms began to scream. A chaotic symphony of synthesized warnings and urgent pre-recorded voices. Engine 1 fire, Engine 2 fire, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is where training is supposed to take over. Muscle memory. The methodical, practiced calm that separates pilots from passengers. But Reeves had been trained in a flawed system. He'd been conditioned by safety parameters that were designed to be ignored. Instead of immediately cutting fuel to the engines and initiating the fire suppression systems, he reacted with a fatal instinct. He tried to outfly the problem. He pulled back on the cyclic, trying to gain altitude to power through the failure. It was the single worst thing he could have done. The virtual HH-60 now a powerless glider with two flaming engines, lost all lift. On the main screen, the horizon began to spin violently. The helicopter entered an unrecoverable death spiral. The altitude reading on the display was plummeting. 1,000 feet, 700, 500. In the control room, the smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. Reeves and his co-pilot were frozen, their faces ashen, their hands locked on the controls as they stared at their impending doom. And Harmon. Harmon was useless. He just stood there, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes wide with disbelief. The architect of the system was paralyzed, unable to utter a single command as his creation spiraled into the ground. There was no time to think, only to act. The ghosts inside me didn't just fly the simulator, they took command. I have control. The words ripped from my throat, a command forged in the crucible of real fire and real fear. It wasn't a request, it was an announcement. In 2 long strides, I was at the main instructor's console. I didn't push the technician aside, I moved him with the force of my presence. My hands flew across the panel, a blur of motion. It was pure instinct, a decade of suppressed experience roaring back to life. Engine 1 fuel cutoff, engaged. Engine 2 fuel cutoff, engaged. Fire suppression system, discharged. Main rotor disengage, auto rotation entry. The movements were precise, economical, drilled into me by hundreds of hours of real-world emergencies. I fought the virtual aircraft, wrestled it back from the brink, stabilizing the spin and guiding the dying machine into a controlled crash landing. The screen showed a hard impact, a shower of digital sparks, and then it all went black. The alarms cut out. The room was plunged into a ringing, absolute silence. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then I straightened up and turned around. I looked first at Reeves. He was trembling, his flight suit soaked in sweat, his eyes wide with the raw terror of a man who had just watched himself die. Then I looked at Harmon. His face was a mask of disbelief and fury. "You just killed your entire crew in a simulation, Lieutenant," I said. My voice was devoid of emotion, as flat and final as a coroner's report. In the real world, you don't get a second chance. Harmon finally found his voice, his rage boiling over in an attempt to reclaim his lost authority. "Major, you have overstepped your authority," he snarled, taking a step toward me. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I looked him dead in the eye, and the full weight of my experience, my loss, and my righteous anger was in that gaze. "Your authority doesn't mean a damn thing when the laws of physics are in play, Colonel," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Your careless training and your doctored parameters almost got them killed. Here. Today." I think we've all had a moment where we had to step up and take control because the person in charge was failing. It's a terrifying and empowering feeling. If you know that feeling, if you've ever had to be the one to fix a mess that wasn't yours, hit that like button. Let's acknowledge that quiet strength. And in the comments, I just want you to write one word: Phoenix. Because sometimes you have to rise up and take command. I let my eyes sweep across the faces of the other senior officers who were now staring at Harmon, then back at me, a new understanding dawning in their expressions. The silence in the room was my closing argument. I was no longer the observer, I was the judge. In combat, you learn about something called the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. It's a process for making critical decisions under fire. For the last 10 years, I had been stuck, endlessly observing my own grief. But after the simulator incident, the loop was finally re-engaged. I was no longer just reacting. I was planning. Observe. Harmon made his first critical mistake less than an hour after the failed check ride. An official memo was circulated stating that the simulator room was being sealed for unscheduled diagnostics. He then formally declared that the system logs from the test had been corrupted by a random data glitch. It was a clumsy, arrogant attempt at a cover-up. He assumed his authority was enough to make the problem disappear. Orient. That evening, Kara met me in a darkened corner of the base library. She didn't say a word, just slid a slim, black external hard drive across the table. I had a feeling he'd try to wipe it, she whispered, her eyes darting around the empty room. I enabled the remote backup protocol the second you hit the emergency stop. It's all there, ma'am. The entire session, every keystroke, including the admin command to delete the primary log file, time-stamped 5 minutes after the room was cleared. Harmon's cover-up had just become my Exhibit A. The next day, I got a text from an unknown number. Fallen Firefighter Memorial, noon, Reeves. The memorial in Colorado Springs is a solemn, quiet place. Bronze statues of firefighters stand frozen in acts of heroism, a permanent tribute to those who run toward the flames. The air is heavy with respect and remembrance. It was the perfect place for a confession. I found Reeves standing before a granite wall etched with the names of the fallen. He looked like he hadn't slept. The swagger was gone, replaced by a deep, weary shame. He didn't look at me when he spoke. I was wrong, Major, he said, his voice quiet and rough. Everything I thought, everything they said about you. I was a damn fool. He finally turned to face me, and his eyes were filled with a humility that only a near-death experience can teach. You saved my life yesterday. I saw my own name on a wall just like this one. He took a deep breath. Harmon called me into his office last night. He had a prepared statement for me to sign. It said the crash was caused by a sudden and unpredictable system malfunction. He wanted me to be his star witness, to lie for him. What did you do? I asked. I told him I wouldn't, Reeves said, a flicker of his old defiance returning. I told him I would only report what actually happened, that his training was flawed, and your intervention was the only reason I'm still standing here. He had just signed up for the fight. He was no longer just a pilot, he was now my star witness. Decide. That night, armed with Kara's hard drive and Reeves's testimony, my course of action was clear. Harmon's current negligence was proven. But to dismantle his career, I needed to connect it to the past. I had to prove this wasn't a recent mistake, but a pattern of behavior. I needed to find David's ghost in the machine. Kara and I turned my small apartment into a digital forensics lab. Fueled by coffee and the pizza she'd brought over, we spent the entire night digging through the massive, labyrinthine archives of the Air Force Maintenance Database. Using my old security credentials, which thankfully were still active, we began the search. It was like looking for a single grain of sand on a vast beach. We searched for Harmon's name, for our old unit number, for any maintenance reports on HH-60s in the Kandahar sector during our deployment. For hours, we found nothing but dead ends and redacted files. Then, around 3 a.m., I had an idea. I stopped searching for the problem and started searching for the solution. I typed in a new set of keywords: Vance, D, and fire suppression analysis. The system churned for a moment, and then a single file appeared on the screen. It was an old technical report, buried under layers of administrative archiving. My heart hammered against my ribs. The title read, Vulnerability Analysis of the HH-60 Fire Warning Module. The author, Captain David Vance. And at the bottom of the first page, 2 stark, brutal words in a digital stamp. Status, denied. Denying. Officer, Captain Jake Harmon. We had found it. The smoking gun. David's voice, preserved in the cold, precise language of a technical report, reaching out across a decade of silence. It was the irrefutable proof that Harmon knew. He had known there was a risk, and he had buried it to protect his mission tempo. He had traded David's life for a clean progress report. Act. The next afternoon, I saw Harmon walking across the main parade ground, chatting amiably with another officer. The time for hiding was over. The time for fear was over. I changed my path to intercept him. He saw me coming, and his easy smile tightened. He dismissed the other officer and stood waiting for me, his arms crossed, a look of defiant arrogance on his face. This wasn't his office. He had no desk to hide behind. Here, we were just 2 officers on a patch of open ground. I stopped a few feet from him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show him the hard drive or the printout of the report. I gave him just one simple sentence, delivered with the cold weight of absolute certainty. I found David's report. For a split second, the mask of the confident commander disintegrated. I saw raw, undiluted panic in his eyes. His face went pale. The change was so fast it was almost imperceptible, but I saw it. He recovered quickly, his expression hardening into a venomous sneer. The pretense was gone. "You have no idea who you're messing with, Scott," he hissed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I will destroy you. I will tear you down until there is nothing left." I looked at this man, this hollow shell of ambition and deceit, and I felt nothing but a profound, cold pity. The fire he was threatening me with was the same fire I'd been living in for 10 years. "You can't destroy something that's been forged in fire, Harmon," I replied, my voice calm and steady. He had no power over me anymore. This is over. After my final confrontation with Harmon, I laid all my cards on the table. I went directly to Colonel Mason, presented him with the hard drive, Reeves's statement, and a copy of David's decade-old report. An official inquiry was launched. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. The night before the hearing, the fire alarms across the base erupted in a deafening, high-pitched scream. My heart seized. I threw on my boots and ran outside. A sickening orange glow was pulsing against the night sky, coming from the direction of the main hangar complex, the hangar that housed the simulators. When I got there, it was chaos. Fire trucks were screaming across the tarmac, people were shouting, and thick black smoke was pouring from the hangar doors. Then, I heard a cry that cut through the noise. "Reeves is still in there." He went back in to double-check the server racks. Everyone froze, a crowd of helpless spectators watching the inferno. But I didn't see a wall of fire. I saw Kandahar. I saw an old ghost, an old failure. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would not let it happen again. There was no thought. There was only instinct. I grabbed a portable fire extinguisher from a nearby truck and plunged into the smoke-filled hangar without a second's hesitation. The heat was a living thing, searing my lungs, blistering my skin. Through the choking blackness, I found him. Reeves was on the floor near the server room, unconscious, overcome by the smoke. I hooked my arms under his and began to drag him, my muscles screaming in protest, my lungs burning. This time, I faced the fire. And this time, I brought my pilot home. My actions that night, the base newspaper later said, turned me from the troublemaker into the hero. But I knew the truth. I was just a pilot refusing to lose another wingman. The formal hearing took place in a sterile, wood-paneled conference room that felt more like a tribunal. It was presided over by a visiting one-star general, a man with a reputation for being tough, but fair. Harmon sat at one end of the long table, flanked by a legal officer. He looked composed, confident, ready to manipulate this system just as he had manipulated everything else. I sat at the other end, my left hand lightly bandaged from the burns. I wasn't there to plead or to persuade. I was there to present facts. One by one, I laid out the evidence. I presented the maintenance logs for the simulator, showing the clear pattern of overridden safety parameters. I submitted the external hard drive with the untampered data from Reeves's failed check ride, a perfect record of the crash Harmon had tried to erase. And then I placed the printout of David's report on the table. "And this, sir," I said, addressing the general, "is a technical analysis written 10 years ago by Captain David Vance, identifying the exact software flaw that led to the deaths of him and his crew. A report that was denied by then-Captain Jake Harmon." Harmon's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is conjecture. Colonel Harmon made a judgment call based on the data available at the time. The Major is connecting unrelated incidents, driven by her own well-documented personal trauma regarding the events in Kandahar." Harmon leaned into his microphone, his face a mask of solemn reason. "Sir, this is simply a tragic case of administrative oversights being misinterpreted by a grieving officer. My record and the performance of my squadron speaks for itself." He was so smooth, so believable. For a moment, I saw a flicker of doubt in the general's eyes. "General," I said, my voice steady, "I have one final piece of evidence." On cue, the door opened and Airman Kara Goyan walked in. She was now under official witness protection and carried herself with a new, quiet confidence. In her hands was the simulator's black box recorder, recovered intact from the fire. "Airman Goyan," Please present the item to the general. Kara placed the hardened steel box on the table. Sir, she said, her voice clear. In recovering the primary data, I found a corrupted audio file in an archived log from our unit's time in Kandahar. I was able to restore it. My heart was pounding. This was it. David's last stand. The file appears to be a voice note left by Captain Vance for Captain Harmon on the internal maintenance comms channel, logged the day before the crash. With your permission, sir, I'd like to play it. The general nodded. Proceed. I hit play on the laptop connected to the room's speakers. A crackle of static filled the room, and then his voice, David's voice, clear and strong and alive, echoing across a decade of silence. Jake, it's Vance. I'm looking at this fire suppression module again. The diagnostic is still flagging it. This isn't a glitch, man. There's a real problem here. If we keep flying without addressing this, and something happens, we're not just negligent. We're complicit. Call me back. The room was utterly silent. It was a voice from the grave, a direct, irrefutable accusation. The color drained from Harmon's face. He looked like he'd been shot. The calm, confident facade crumbled into a mask of pure, abject panic. And then, the door at the back of the room opened again. Lieutenant Reeves walked in, his arm in a sling, a bandage on his forehead. He walked to the center of the room, came to attention, and rendered a sharp salute, not to the general, but to me. Sir, Reeves said, turning to the general, I am here to state for the record that Lieutenant Colonel Harmon personally ordered me to sign a false statement regarding the cause of my simulator crash. I refused then, and I am here now to tell the truth. It was over. The lies had completely unraveled. The voice from the past and the testimony of the present formed an inescapable cage of truth around Jake Harmon. The general stood up slowly. He stared at Harmon, and his eyes held a look of such profound contempt that it seemed to physically shrink the man in his chair. He didn't even speak to him. He turned his gaze to me, and the hardness in his expression softened. Major Scott, he said, his voice resonating with authority and something else. Respect. Welcome back, Phoenix. The sky needs pilots like you. Justice had been served. The weeks following the hearing were a blur of official proceedings and quiet congratulations. The adrenaline of the fight faded, leaving behind a strange, hollow calm. Victory, I discovered, was much quieter than the battle. 3 months later, the final judgment came down. Jake Harmon was found guilty on multiple counts, including dereliction of duty and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was stripped of his rank and dishonorably discharged. The day of his court-martial, I didn't go. I had no desire to witness his downfall. My victory wasn't seeing him broken, it was seeing the truth acknowledged. His fate was just a footnote. The good guys won, too. Kara was promoted to senior airman ahead of schedule and awarded the Air Force Commendation Medal for her integrity and courage. She was transferred to a top-tier cyber warfare unit, her talents finally recognized. Reeves, after recovering from his minor injuries, returned to flight duty a different man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility and a fierce dedication to his craft. He would stop by my office sometimes just to talk, not about the past, but about the future of flight safety. A fragile, respectful friendship began to grow. Then came the offer from Washington. The top brass, eager to turn a public relations disaster into a story of heroism, offered me a prestigious position at the Pentagon. It was a fast track to a full colonelcy, a corner office, a comfortable and powerful end to a turbulent career. It was the dream of so many officers. I thought about it for a week. I pictured the polished hallways, the endless meetings, the political games played far from the smell of jet fuel and the roar of engines. I had seen the system from the inside, seen how men like Harmon could thrive in the shadows of bureaucracy. I knew that real change didn't happen in those sanitized, powerful offices. It happened on the flight line. It happened in the briefing rooms. It happened in the hearts of young pilots. I respectfully declined the Pentagon's offer. Instead, I made a counter-proposal, a bold one. I asked for command of the training squadron at Vanguard. I asked for the authority to tear down Harmon's flawed program and rebuild it from the ground up. based on the principles of integrity, transparency, and the hard-won lessons of the past. To my surprise, they agreed. One cool evening, as the sun began to set behind the Rockies, I drove to the cemetery at the Air Force Academy. David's grave was on a gentle slope, marked by a simple, elegant white headstone. I had avoided this place for a decade. It felt too final, too quiet. But now it just felt peaceful. I sat on the grass beside the cold stone, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through the ponderosa pines. I didn't cry. The time for tears was long past. I just sat there and talked to him, my voice a low murmur. I told him about Harmon, about the simulator, about Kara and Reeves. I told him how his voice, his words from a decade ago, had been the key that unlocked everything. "I did it, David," I whispered, my fingers tracing the letters of his name carved into the marble. I finally stopped letting fear make my decisions for me. From the leather pouch I always carried, I took out his burnt dog tags. For 10 years, they had been a physical weight in my pocket, a constant, heavy reminder of my failure. I gently placed them on top of his headstone, a final offering. But as I pulled my hand back, my fingers hesitated. I picked them up again. The metal felt different in my palm. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was a part of me. A reminder not of loss, but of the truth we fought for. I slipped them back into my pocket. That night, back in my apartment, I did something I hadn't done since I was a young cadet writing home to my parents. I sat down and wrote a letter. It wasn't on a computer. I used a simple pen and a sheet of plain white paper. The letter had no recipient, no address. It would never be mailed. The salutation was simple. To the woman I was. I wrote to the 32-year-old Amelia Scott, the one who was so full of confidence and so blind to the quiet corruption around her. The one who had trusted the system, who had told her best friend not to worry. I wrote to the woman who had spent 10 years carrying a cross of guilt that wasn't entirely hers to bear. I told her that she wasn't stupid for trusting someone. I told her that she wasn't weak for believing in the chain of command. I told her she had been exhausted and scared and had done the best she could with what she knew at the time. I wrote about the crash, not as a failure, but as a crucible. A fire that had burned away her naivety and left something stronger in its place. And then, I wrote the 2 most difficult words of my life. I forgive you. By forgiving that younger version of myself, I felt a profound shift, a release I hadn't known was possible. It was as if I'd been holding my breath for 10 years and could finally exhale. I wasn't just freeing myself. I was finally letting David's spirit rest, separating the memory of the man I loved from the tragedy that took him. I folded the letter, placed it in a small wooden box with the old letters he had sent me, and closed the lid. The prison of the past had finally lost its hold. The work of rebuilding is slow, quiet, and deliberate. It doesn't have the adrenaline of a battle or the drama of a hearing. It's the meticulous work of laying one brick at a time, ensuring the foundation is solid enough to withstand any storm. My new command was that foundation. We called the new training curriculum the Phoenix Directive. It was more than just a syllabus. It was a philosophy. We still taught the advanced flight mechanics, the emergency procedures, the hard skills that keep you alive at 500 feet. But woven into every lesson was a focus on the things Harmon's program had ignored: integrity, accountability, and the brutal honesty of crisis decision-making. We created scenarios where the right choice wasn't the easy one, where admitting a mistake was valued more than feigning perfection. We taught our pilots that the most important instrument in the cockpit wasn't on the control panel. It was their own moral compass. Kara, before she left for her new post, volunteered her time to help me design the new simulation protocols. She built in safeguards and transparent logging systems that made it impossible for anyone to ever manipulate the data again. And the first student to enroll in the pilot course, the first to test the new system, was Lieutenant Reeves. He wasn't just a student, he was a testament to the program's purpose. He was living proof that we could learn, that we could change, that we could be better. We weren't just training pilots anymore. We were forging leaders who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to do the right thing in spite of it. One evening, I was in my new office, one with a window overlooking the flight line, when an email popped up on my screen. It was from Reeves. The subject line read, "Training Sortie Report." The body of the email was a concise, professional summary of a successful high-altitude rescue simulation he'd just completed. But it was the closing that made me stop. He had signed off with his new official call sign. It read, "Respectfully, Lieutenant Scott Reeves, Vector." Vector, not Vance. Something new but with a clear direction, a clear lineage. The name honored the past without being trapped by it. It was about moving forward, carrying the best parts of what came before into the future. I leaned back in my chair and smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. David would have been proud of this kid. His legacy wasn't just a memory, it was alive and flying in the next generation. The story ends as it began, in the sky. A few months later, I'm sitting in the left seat of a brand new H-60W Pave Hawk, the latest and greatest version of the bird that has defined my life. The smell of the cockpit is different. Less oil and metal, more clean electronics and composite materials. But the soul of the machine is the same. To my right, in the co-pilot seat, is Reeves. We're conducting his final evaluation flight together. Before we start the pre-flight checklist, I reach into my flight suit pocket and pull out David's dog tags. The metal is still warped and blackened, a permanent scar. But it no longer feels heavy with grief. Using a small strip of military-grade Velcro, I secure the tags to a flat, open space on the main instrument panel, right next to the attitude indicator. They're not a memorial to the past anymore. They're a compass for the future. I look at them not with pain, but with a quiet, profound gratitude. "Ready to fly, Vector?" I ask, my voice calm in the headset. "Ready, Phoenix," he replies, his voice steady and confident. I run through the checklist, my hands moving with an easy, familiar grace over the controls. With a final flick of a switch, the twin turbine engines wind to life, the rotor blades beginning their slow, powerful sweep, turning the air into a blur above us. As I gently pull up on the collective, the powerful machine lifts off the ground, light as a feather. We climb, leaving the hard lines and shadows of the base behind. Below us, the vast expanse of Colorado Springs begins to shrink, and ahead, the sun is just beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange, pink, and gold. For the first time in a decade, I feel a sense of peace so complete it's almost overwhelming. I finally understand what it truly means to bring them home. It wasn't just about getting your crew back to base. It was about the long, difficult journey of bringing your own soul back from the fire. The smoke has cleared, the ghosts have been laid to rest, and ahead of me, there is nothing but a clear, blue, wide-open sky. I'm no longer flying to escape something. I'm flying because it's who I am. It's where I belong. I am, finally and truly, the Phoenix. That open sky wasn't just my new beginning. It's a reminder for all of us. My story started from a place of being dismissed and silenced, a feeling I know many of you have shared. If this journey has resonated with you, if it has given you a piece of strength to find your own voice, that is the greatest mission I could ever hope to fly. Thank you for being my wingman on this journey. Please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because there are so many more stories of resilience and justice to share. Your support helps keep these stories alive.